A murder seen through feline eyes. What secrets did the cat catch? Welcome to Detective Noir. I am your host, Daniel Mercer. Tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing how far this mystery travels. Your voices bring this story alive. Let's begin. On a bright June afternoon in the village of Little Witchford, the vicarage garden was alive with laughter, cucumber sandwiches, and the clink of china cups. The annual Afternoon for the Preservation of the Church Roof Fund was one of those thoroughly English affairs that gave villagers the illusion of harmless unity, while subtly reinforcing every social hierarchy. The Reverend Sidney Prowse, cheerfully sunburnt and already 3 sponge cakes deep, moved through the crowd like a benevolent sheepdog. He congratulated Mrs. Cumberbatch on her roses, though they were undoubtedly dyed, praised the village schoolchildren's rather off-key recorder rendition of God Save the Queen, and tried valiantly to avoid the overzealous lemon curd from the WI tent. Delightful turnout, he beamed, speaking to no one in particular. Miss Jane Marple, quietly seated beneath the flowering clematis by the stone wall, watched the proceedings with the expression of one who had seen many village gatherings and suspected they rarely ended as innocently as they began. She sipped her tea, murmured approvingly at the jam tarts, and kept one pale blue eye on a rather curious sight, Mrs. Millie Ledbetter's tabby cat Thistle. The animal sat perfectly still atop a stone bench near the garden's edge, unblinking, its green eyes trained. On the rear path that led into the hedgerow, Miss Marple knew animals had instincts that humans had long since dulled with politeness. It was precisely 2 minutes later that a scream shattered the placid air, not the performative squeal of someone finding a bee in the Victoria sponge, nor the exaggerated gasp of a woman discovering a dent in her meringue. This was different, real. It came from behind the rose trellises near the vegetable patch where old Mr. Benwick had been showing off his prize radishes. "Someone fetch the police," cried Mrs. Winifred Pym, her mauve hat trembling as she ran forward, clutching her handbag like a weapon. "It's Mr. Geoffrey Denning, he's dead." Gasps rose like birds from every corner of the vicarage lawn. Cups clattered to saucers. Miss Hartnell dropped her knitting into a bowl of gooseberries. Miss Marple set her tea down gently, folded her gloves into her lap, and stood. She didn't hurry, as others did, toward the site of the commotion. Instead, she moved quietly toward the bench where Thistle the cat had remained, still as a statue, eyes now closed as if in solemn judgment. Geoffrey Denning, Little Witchford's newest resident, had been renting the old Langtree place just up the lane. A retired solicitor, or so he claimed, with no wife, no children, and a gaze that had left several village women slightly uncomfortable without knowing why. He had made enemies quicker than friends, and now he was dead. Miss Marple looked once at the gathering throng, the cries of "fainted dead away" and "get the doctor," and then back at the cat. "Oh dear," she said softly to herself. "I rather thought something like this might happen." She looked toward the hedgerow path, the very one Thistle had watched so intently. "People always forget," Miss Marple mused, "that cats do observe things. They simply never tell." The body of Mr. Geoffrey Denning was found half sprawled beneath the arbor where the vicar's wife had arranged pots of lavender and begonias. His walking cane lay beside him, half buried in the damp grass, and his expression, so the villagers would later whisper, was one of astonishment, as though death had arrived not with drama, but with impolite surprise. Dr. Lyle was summoned from his game of croquet and pronounced Mr. Denning quite beyond help. "Heart, most likely," he murmured as he straightened up, wiping his hands on a handkerchief that looked rather too decorative to be useful. "But of course we must wait for the authorities." By the time Inspector Craddock arrived from Muchminster, the garden was full of murmurs. The guests, now corralled near the jam stall, stood in awkward clusters. Tea had gone cold. Laughter was smothered under layers of speculation. Miss Marple sat with Miss Hartnell, who had recovered from her gooseberry misfortune and was now sipping a restorative sherry from someone's hip flask. Miss Marple declined the offer of a sip herself, but accepted a small biscuit, which she nibbled absently, her eyes occasionally drifting to the scene beneath the arbor. Geoffrey Denning had not been a popular man. In the fortnight since his arrival in Little Witchford, he had offended Mr. Benwick by suggesting that prize vegetables should be judged on flavour rather than appearance, earned Mrs. Ledbetter's disdain by laughing at the parish flower rota. and made several unwelcome comments about local property values that smacked of London arrogance. Yet, despite his disagreeable manner, no one had expected quite so permanent a departure. "Well," said Miss Hartnell, whispering behind her hand, "if you ask me, it was bound to happen." He looked the sort, didn't he? The shifty eyes, and all that time spent in his garden alone at night. "I dare say he was hiding something." Miss Marple nodded politely but said nothing. She was watching the cat. Thistle had wandered a little, now perched atop the low garden wall. Its tail flicked once sharply, as a uniformed constable ducked beneath the arbor's beams to inspect the body. Inspector Craddock, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying himself with the weary air of one familiar with rural theatrics, approached Miss Marple with the respectful wariness of a man who had once had his assumptions dismantled by a pensioner with a passion for knitting and an alarming gift for deduction. "Miss Marple," he said with a faint sigh. "You were here when it happened?" She smiled. "As were 50 others, Inspector. But yes, I was seated just there by the clematis." He followed her gaze, then looked back at the arbor. "And you didn't see anything unusual?" She tilted her head. "Nothing so vivid as an act of violence. But the cat, Thistle, Mrs. Ledbetter's, you know, was very alert before the scream. She was watching that hedgerow path." Inspector Craddock, who did not generally take statements from felines, gave a small cough. "Indeed. You might find," said Miss Marple gently, "that Thistle noticed something more telling than any of us." He gave her a long look. "I'll have my constable speak with the guests. See who last spoke to Denning, who noticed anything strange. But between you and me, Dr. Lyle says it looks like a cardiac arrest." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And yet there is such a thing as a caused heart attack, is there not?" She offered the remark so mildly, it might have been about over-salted soup. Craddock's mouth twitched. "You suspect foul play already?" "I suspect," said Miss Marple with an apologetic smile, "that people are rarely as sudden as all that, particularly in English villages. A man may arrive suddenly, but he does not die suddenly, unless someone has had cause to hurry him along. By evening, the garden was cleared, the body removed, and the village buzzed like a hive of over-disturbed bees. Back on Church Lane, Mrs. Pym stood at her front gate and declared to anyone within earshot that she had always said Mr. Denning had the look of a wrong-un. "Had that mole on his cheek," she said darkly. "And I've read that moles like that mean a secret past." At the post office, Miss Crabtree confidently told a customer that Denning had definitely been in some sort of trouble in London. Tax evasion or a mistress, something juicy. She had no evidence beyond the fact that he'd asked for a London telephone directory and had once mispronounced scone. Meanwhile, Miss Marple returned to her ivy-covered cottage and boiled water for tea. The day's drama had not fatigued her. In fact, it seemed to sharpen her focus. She carefully laid out the pieces in her mind. A man not well liked, a death too abrupt, a cat watching the hedgerow. She poured the tea, sat in her comfortable chair, and let her thoughts settle like cream in a teacup. It was the hedgerow that interested her. She remembered seeing a movement there just before the scream, a flutter perhaps, or the glimpse of fabric. Not a clear image, but something registered by long habit, the way one notices the absence of a familiar face before one can name it. If someone had exited or entered the garden that way, they would have passed behind the arbor, and behind Geoffrey Denning. She would, she decided, have to pay a call to Mrs. Ledbetter in the morning. Miss Marple did not consider herself intrusive. She simply understood that small, polite visits were far more informative than formal interviews. One could always learn more in 10 minutes over sponge cake than in an hour with a notebook. She slept well, as she always did, and rose with the sun, her morning routine untouched by murder. By 10, she was walking toward Ashgrove Cottage, where Mrs. Ledbetter lived alone, save for Thistle. Mrs. Ledbetter answered in a flurry of apron and garden gloves. "Oh, Jane, do come in. Yes, it's all everyone's talking about, poor Mr. Denning. I never liked him, I'll admit it. Always asking odd questions about the old Deverell property and calling it undervalued. Who does that at a church fundraiser?" Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and asked gently if Thistle had seemed disturbed. "Thistle?" Mrs. Ledbetter looked surprised. "Oh, she's been ever so calm. A bit fixated on that hedgerow, though. Sat there nearly all afternoon yesterday. She only does that when she sees mice, or strangers," Miss Marple said lightly. Mrs. Ledbetter paused. You know, come to think of it, she did hiss yesterday just before the scream. I thought she'd seen a bird. Miss Marple nodded. Or a person she didn't like. Do you think someone... could someone have done it, Jane? I don't know, Miss Marple said, standing. But I do believe that when a man dies in full view of half the village and no one sees anything, someone is lying. Or hiding. And as she stepped out into the sunlight, a breeze stirred the hedgerow leaves. Somewhere beyond them a truth was waiting. And Jane Marple intended to find it. Miss Marple did not go straight home after her visit with Mrs. Ledbetter. Instead, she turned right at the fork where the road narrowed and grew hushed, under the overhang of sycamores, and made her way to the far edge of the village, where the Deverell property stood in a slight depression beyond the stone bridge. Once a grand estate, the house now bore the wear of a place lived in by time rather than tenants. The windows stared like blind eyes across the field, and its shutters sagged like tired arms. Miss Marple had seen many fine houses fall into decay, but there was something about the Deverell place that resisted sympathy. It was also the property that Geoffrey Denning had inquired about several times in his short residence in Little Witchford. He had even, so the vicar's wife whispered, asked whether the grounds were still tied up in trust, and if the deed was in town or stored locally. Why would a man with no stated interest in buying wish to know so much about an abandoned estate? Miss Marple did not trespass, of course, but she walked the perimeter slowly, observing. There were footprints near the back gate, not yet blurred by rain, and a broken branch low to the ground, freshly snapped. More curious still, the latch on the garden gate was missing its bolt. She made a mental note. On her way back to the main lane, she encountered young Peter Hawkes wheeling his bicycle in the opposite direction. Peter was 13, all limbs and elbows, and the sort of boy who noticed things when no one thought he was paying attention. "Good morning, Peter," she said. "Out for a ride?" He nodded, flushed from effort or embarrassment. "Just been down to the mill pond, Miss Marple. Tadpoles and such. Any luck?" "There are few," he said, then added, after a moment's awkward pause, "I saw Mr. Denning down there day before yesterday. He had a little notebook writing things down. That was interesting. At the pond?" she asked gently. "No, not quite. By the fence where the old boundary stones are." He looked at them, then checked his notebook, then put something in his coat pocket. "Did he seem upset?" Peter frowned. "Not really, sort of tight, I suppose. Like he was keeping something in." Miss Marple smiled. "That's a very good observation." "Peter!" He brightened at the praise, then blushed and hurried away, pedalling fast. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the sun was high and the village fully immersed in its favourite occupation, speculation. Miss Hartnell had already stopped by with a fresh theory, poisoned plum jam, left carelessly at the fundraising table by someone hoping Denning would choose it. Mrs. Pym had amended her mole theory to include the possibility of Mr. Denning being a foreign agent. And Mr. Benwick, grumbling in the post office, muttered about how these things always happened when outsiders got too nosy. Miss Marple settled in with her knitting, working her needles rhythmically as she considered what she had gathered so far. Geoffrey Denning had not been a man taken by whimsy. He had come to Little Witchford under a quiet pretext, a retired solicitor, resting from the bustle of the city, but nothing about his behaviour suggested rest. He had questioned the ownership of the Deverell estate, taken notes on boundary stones, examined property records, and asked pointed questions about inheritance, and then he had died at a public event, surrounded by witnesses without a clear cause. By late afternoon, Inspector Craddock returned. She saw him from her window, and before long there came a knock at the door. "May I come in?" he asked, stepping in without waiting for more than the gentlest nod. She poured him tea, properly steeped, and gave him a plate of biscuits she had made that morning. Craddock sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Pathologists' early notes say there's no sign of a heart attack. No stroke, no rupture, nothing obvious, no poisons?" she asked. "Preliminary tests show nothing." He hesitated, then added, "But the doctor says the heart stopped, suddenly. Abrupt failure. It could still be something subtle." Miss Marple nodded, more thoughtful than surprised. "Tell me, Inspector, did he have anything in his pockets?" Craddock blinked. "Why, yes. A notebook, actually. Mostly filled with numbers and some abbreviated references. And, oddly, an old iron key. Very old by the look of it, like a gate key or a cellar. Miss Marple's knitting paused. Was there any indication of where the key came from? None, though it was recently cleaned. That's what struck me. It had a bit of polished smell on it. She smiled faintly. How interesting. He leaned forward. You have a theory, Miss Marple? Don't deny it. I have the makings of a puzzle, she said. Nothing more. Yet puzzles do require a centerpiece, and I begin to suspect Mr. Denning wasn't the picture on the box. He was just a corner, an inconvenient one for someone else. She reached to her side table and picked up a volume of land records, which she had requested long ago from the county for a completely different reason. But habits of careful filing paid off. I believe, she said softly, that the Deverell property is not quite as empty as it looks. Inspector Craddock frowned. Squatters? No, she said, turning pages. Heirs, or more likely, disputed heirs. You see, the Deverell estate was never fully resolved after the last death. A daughter married abroad. A nephew was thought to have drowned during the war. And I rather think Mr. Denning knew more than he admitted. Are you suggesting he was blackmailing someone? I think he believed he had a claim, or held proof of someone else's false one, and if so, it would not have been kindly received. Craddock nodded slowly. I'll need to track the inheritance chain. Interview the solicitors. Yes, she said. But you should also speak to Miss Diana Westlake. Craddock frowned. The piano teacher? She is not originally from Little Witchford, Miss Marple said gently. She arrived last year, you know, quietly. Took a room with Mrs. Ketteridge and began teaching the vicar's niece. Her background is vague. She claims to be from Harrogate, but I suspect she is more closely connected to the Deverells than she would admit. Craddock narrowed his eyes. You think she had something to lose? Or something to gain, Miss Marple corrected. As dusk fell across the village, the hedgerows darkened, and the vicarage lawn was empty again. But in the narrow upstairs room of Mrs. Ketteridge's house, Diana Westlake sat at her small desk, the lamplight flickering across her pale face as she leafed through a folder of yellowed papers. She paused on a birth certificate, stared at it, and then quietly slid it back into the envelope and locked the drawer. She did not notice the cat watching her from the garden wall. But Thistle blinked once slowly and did not move. The following morning brought a mild mist to Little Witchford, the kind that softened the hedgerows and curled about the rooftops like the breath of old secrets. Miss Marple stepped into it with her customary cardigan and straw hat, nodding to Mrs. Bicknell, who was scrubbing her doorstep with unnecessary fervour and a suspicious eye on the baker's boy. Terrible business, isn't it, Miss Marple? She called, though her voice carried the unmistakable relish of a woman who intended to retell every detail before the week's end. First Denning dead, and now poor Miss Westlake being talked about by half the village. Miss Marple merely smiled. The world has always found time to talk, Mrs. Bicknell, whether the subject has earned it or not. She turned toward the vicarage path. The Reverend Prowse had requested her advice, though not in so many words, on the delicate subject of his upcoming sermon. Grace in a time of disquiet, he had called it, which Miss Marple found rather hopeful, considering how few people in the village were feeling anything close to grace. The meeting was brief. Miss Marple suggested Ecclesiastes and tactfully avoided the Reverend's attempt to work. In the phrase, the wicked shall perish without warning, but on leaving, she saw something that stopped her gently in her tracks. Diana Westlake was standing by the lich gate, her gloved hands clasped tightly, as she spoke to a man Miss Marple did not recognize. He was tall with a sharp chin and a grey overcoat of expensive cut. They spoke in low voices, too low to catch, but Miss Marple noted the line of Miss Westlake's jaw. It was tense, not with grief or fear, but with controlled anger. The man said something final and stepped away. Miss Westlake remained where she stood, unmoving, for several seconds. Then, as though sensing Miss Marple's gaze, she turned and smiled faintly. But her eyes were not warm. Her eyes were not warm. Her eyes— Miss Marple, she said, stepping forward. A lovely morning, isn't it? Though I do feel as though half the village is watching me through their curtains. Miss Marple returned the smile with equal gentleness. You know how villagers are. We often believe we're protecting something when really we're just frightened of change. Miss Westlake tilted her head. Is that what Mr. Denning represented, then? Change, perhaps. Or maybe the past returning unexpectedly. There was the smallest pause. I suppose it's difficult for some to see outsiders as anything but intruders, Miss Westlake said with careful neutrality. Some people, Miss Marple agreed, and others recognize that strangers bring their own histories, and sometimes they share them only under duress. Miss Westlake gave a soft, dry laugh. If I were being accused, I'd hope to have you for an advocate. Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she adjusted her gloves. I'm not accusing you, my dear, but I do believe you were acquainted with Mr. Denning before he came to Little Witchford. There was a flicker, so brief most would have missed it, of panic in Miss Westlake's eyes. It vanished quickly, replaced by a look of resignation. We met once, years ago. He wouldn't have remembered. I suspect he did, said Miss Marple, not unkindly. He seemed a man who remembered very precisely when it served him. Miss Westlake hesitated, then said softly, he was my uncle. Not legally, but my mother was a Deverell, the only surviving child. She ran away to France when she was 18. The family disowned her. Mr. Denning. He knew about her and he knew I existed. I came here hoping to, she broke off, to claim what might have been hers. But Mr. Denning had a different idea, Miss Marple said gently. Yes, he believed he had a right to it, or that I didn't. And so he used the threat of exposure? Miss Westlake nodded. He didn't even demand money. Just control. That's worse in some ways. Miss Marple's tone did not change. And when did you last speak with him? 3 days before he died. I hadn't seen him since. Her voice didn't shake. I avoided the garden party entirely. Ask anyone. I don't doubt it. But do you know where he might have kept records? Something that would confirm your inheritance or deny it? Miss Westlake hesitated, then looked up. There's a safe in the cellar of the Deverell house. My mother told me about it before she died. He had the key. Miss Marple's brow lifted ever so slightly. Then I suppose that key he carried would open it. Miss Westlake's voice dropped. I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. But I might have if he'd pushed me much further. Miss Marple nodded once, very slowly. Later that afternoon, Inspector Craddock returned to Little Witchford. He'd had a productive morning in Muchminster, speaking with a solicitor who'd handled the Deverell family's legal affairs in the 1950s. You were right, he told Miss Marple as they walked along the edge of the village green. There's a question of legal inheritance. The property was left in limbo when Thomas Deverell's will went into dispute. His daughter, Diana's mother, was written out of it when she ran off. But there's no formal documentation disinheriting her, and thus Diana by birth may still be entitled. Exactly. But Geoffrey Denning was acting as a private party, trying to stake a claim. He had just enough knowledge to sound credible. The solicitor suspects he forged a codicil. Miss Marple nodded. And Diana's appearance threatened that fabrication. Quite a motive, Craddock said grimly. But no evidence she was near the scene. No, Miss Marple said quietly. But someone else was. She led him to the arbor. The grass had been cut now, and the bloodless spot where Denning had fallen was barely discernible. But a small object lay nestled in the grass near the bench, overlooked before, perhaps dropped in panic. Miss Marple picked it up delicately in a gloved hand. A silver brooch in the shape of a thistle. Mrs. Ledbetter's? Craddock asked. No, said Miss Marple, though she has many cat-shaped ones. This belonged to Clarice Fielding. She used to work for the Deverell family as a lady's companion. She's often said she resented how things ended, dismissed after the war without so much as a reference. Craddock frowned. She was at the garden party. She was, Miss Marple said. And she took the back path just after the scream, saying she was searching for her dropped gloves. Craddock's face darkened. So she may have come from the hedgerow instead, before the scream. Miss Marple nodded. It would explain why Thistle the cat was watching that way and hissed. They visited Mrs. Fielding's home, a neat little bungalow with lace curtains and a prim white gate. She greeted them with the stiffness of a woman determined to appear composed, but when Miss Marple held out the brooch, the composure crumbled. I didn't mean to kill him, she whispered, hands trembling. I only meant to scare him. He was going to rob the girl, Diana. Her mother was kind to me once. I couldn't bear to see that weasel take what wasn't his. Craddock asked the obvious. What did you do? I followed him from the back. He was alone by the arbor. I only meant to confront him, warn him I'd go to the solicitor. But he laughed. Said no one would believe a disgraced companion. Then he clutched his chest and fell. I didn't even touch him. Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. "So you ran," Mrs. Fielding wept silently. I panicked. I didn't know he was dying. "I thought if they found me there, they'd blame me." Craddock exhaled. So his death really was natural, but brought on by stress or guilt, Miss Marple said. Either way, Mrs. Fielding didn't strike the blow, but she struck the chord. That evening, as the village settled once more into its uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting in her lap, a cup of tea cooling beside her. She looked out at the stone bench, where Thistle now curled, eyes half-lidded in feline contentment. The cat had seen what no one else had, not a hand with a weapon, but the subtle shift in human nature, fear, desperation, a reckoning long overdue. And Miss Marple, wise to such tremors, had simply followed where the cat had watched. The next morning dawned still and pale, the sky the colour of old lace. The tension that had hung like a curtain over Little Witchford since Mr. Denning's death had not lifted. It had only changed shape. The village now knew there had been no blunt object, no trace of poison or knife. Yet the knowledge that Geoffrey Denning had died not through violence, but through the precise pressures of confrontation, did not comfort anyone. On the contrary, it unsettled them more. It was too clean, too quiet, too clever. And in Little Witchford that meant one of them had done it, Inspector Craddock, whose return to Muchminster had been postponed due to new lines of inquiry, found himself back at the vicarage, poring over statements with little satisfaction. Clarice Fielding's account matched what they now believed. She had approached Denning, said her piece, and he had collapsed, struck down not by hand but by a sudden, lethal jolt of the heart. The pathologist's full report confirmed no sign of direct interference. Yet Craddock, a man who'd seen more than his share of villains and victims, remained uneasy. It was Miss Marple, of course, who gave form to that unease. "You're wondering, Inspector," she said calmly as she passed him a plate of her walnut biscuits, "whether a death can be engineered without any physical violence at all." Craddock accepted a biscuit, but didn't bite. "It's like a trap door, Miss Marple. One moment Denning's alive, the next he's gone. And no one laid a finger on him. That's what unsettles me." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. "There are people, Inspector," she said, "who are perfectly capable of killing without ever intending to. They nudge. They suggest. They reveal truths at just the right or wrong moment. The blow they deliver is not to the body but to the mind." Craddock nodded slowly. "Psychological pressure. Indeed, Mr. Denning, for all his outward confidence, may have been one such person. And Miss Fielding. Well, hers was not the only confrontation he'd had that week." Craddock set down his tea. "You believe there was another confrontation?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that someone else warned him off. And that Mr. Denning, being who he was, recorded that encounter in his notebook." Craddock narrowed his eyes. "You said before he took notes at the pond. Peter Hawkes saw him. But we haven't been through that notebook properly yet. Not line by line. I rather think," Miss Marple said, rising, "that we ought to pay the Deverell house a visit." Craddock, unused to being instructed by anyone with snow-white hair and a fondness for lavender sachets, nonetheless complied. There was something in her voice that made refusal absurd. An hour later, with a constable and a crowbar, they stepped into the echoing silence of the Deverell house. The interior smelled of dust, stone, and the faintest trace of coal smoke from years past. It was not a house one could call empty. It merely slept, heavily and with poor dreams. The cellar, reached by a narrow staircase behind a panelled door, was even colder. At the far wall sat an old iron safe, its corners rusted, its dial smeared with fingerprints. The key, recovered from Denning's coat, turned in the lock with a reluctant click. Inside lay a stack of yellowing papers, several envelopes sealed with wax, and a slim leather notebook. Miss Marple stepped back to let Craddock lift it out. He opened it carefully. Inside, Denning's handwriting, precise loyally, documented everything he had discovered since arriving in Little Witchford. References to the property, Craddock murmured, scanning. Mentions Diana Westlake as possibly the legitimate heir. Mentions a forged codicil, then... He paused. A line dated 2 days before his death. He read aloud. "Threat received from E.B. under pretense of village courtesy. Knows more than I realized. Possible connection to original Deverell dispute. Must tread carefully." Craddock looked up. E.B.? Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes took on a glint of clear, solemn recognition. Edmund Braithwaite, she said quietly. The solicitor? No longer. He retired several years ago, and returned here to live out his years quietly, though I dare say with a keen interest in village affairs. He was the junior partner in the original Deverell estate case. That would make him the only man still alive who knew exactly how much wasn't written into the public record. Craddock blinked. He's the one Denning was referring to. I suspect Mr. Braithwaite warned Denning that he would not allow Diana's claim to go unchallenged. Perhaps he even threatened to expose Denning's own forged documents. But if Braithwaite warned Denning, Craddock said slowly, and Denning was already under stress, then Miss Fielding's final confrontation may have just been the last push. The second one. Miss Marple's tone remained calm. 2 pressures, one moral, one emotional. It was enough. They left the house as the sun broke through the mist and walked slowly back toward the village square. Craddock stopped as they reached the green. I'll need to speak to Braithwaite, he said, and Miss Westlake. She should know she's in the clear now. Miss Marple gave a slow nod, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. But later that afternoon, before Craddock could call at Mr. Braithwaite's cottage, the man in question arrived at Miss Marple's door. He was tall, slender, and walked with a cane more for dignity than need. His silver hair was brushed back, and his eyes, sharp, pale, and faintly amused, took in her sitting room like a chess player appraising the board. "You've been busy, Miss Marple," he said, accepting a cup of her strong Darjeeling. "Craddock has the notebook, I suppose?" "He does. Then I'll be quick." He sipped his tea, sighed, and said, "I warned Denning. I told him he was walking on rotten beams. But he didn't listen. Or rather, he did and thought I was bluffing. You weren't." "No." His eyes met hers. "Because I knew about Diana. Her mother wrote to me once, years after she left. She begged me not to destroy what little future her daughter might one day have." Miss Marple nodded. "And you kept that letter?" "In my safe." His voice was quiet. "I knew she'd come looking one day. I just didn't expect Denning to get there first." He looked toward the window, where Thistle the cat now sat on the ledge, perfectly still. "I've always believed the law must protect the truth," he murmured. "But the truth is not always convenient, is it?" "No," Miss Marple said. "It's rarely convenient, but it's always necessary." Braithwaite stood slowly. "I'll go to Craddock. Tell him what I know. It may not be enough to prosecute anyone, but it will be enough to set things right." Miss Marple rose with him. "You did the right thing, Mr. Braithwaite, in the end." He paused, hand on the doorknob. "In the end, Miss Marple, most of us do. The trouble is, the end often comes too late." After he left, Miss Marple sat in silence for some time. Outside, the village had already begun to fold the latest scandal into its patchwork of half-truths and garden gossip. Geoffrey Denning would become a cautionary tale, told over teacups and hedges. Diana Westlake would live with suspicion at her back, and Clarice Fielding would knit quietly, forever burdened by what might have been guilt. And yet, beneath it all, justice had been served. Not by courtroom, but by consequence. Miss Marple looked down at her knitting, where the rows had grown uneven. She sighed and began to unravel them. Some things, after all, had to be redone properly from the beginning. The news of Mr. Denning's death had begun to lose its sharpness by the 6th day. In Little Witchford, grief did not linger long unless the deceased had been born in the village, baptized at St. Oswald's, and known to have shared their marrow with the church roof fund. Mr. Denning, an outsider through and through, was already being replaced by more palatable topics, like the rumour that Mrs. Grimshaw's eldest son was courting someone from Leeds, or the scandal of Miss Partridge's quince gin, which was said to have felled a visiting cousin with one thimbleful. But while the village retreated into familiar chatter, Miss Marple knew the story had not yet finished unfolding. There was something still missing, a note out of tune, a corner of the puzzle that hadn't clicked into place. Mr. Braithwaite's confession had explained the inheritance dispute, and Clarice Fielding's confrontation accounted for the final pressure that likely stopped Denning's heart. Yet something felt too neatly resolved. That evening, she reread the transcribed notes from Denning's journal, kindly copied out by Inspector Craddock. She found herself returning to one line in particular, easily overlooked but lingering in her mind like a whisper from behind a door. Observed cat again, unnerving, seems to watch everything. Miss Marple folded the page. It was not the cat's behavior that mattered. Rather, it was Denning's reaction to it. He had noticed Thistle's gaze more than once, noted it down and been troubled by it. Why? She sat very still in her armchair, the ticking of the hall clock the only sound. Slowly her eyes moved to the window. The twilight hour had begun. Shadows stretched across her rose bushes, and beyond the hedgerow, she saw the faint flicker of a lamp being lit in Mrs. Ledbetter's drawing room. Thistle sat perched on the garden wall, tail wrapped around her paws. Facing east, Miss Marple stood and reached for her shawl. It was not unusual for Miss Marple to visit Mrs. Ledbetter unannounced. A small cake, or the excuse of borrowed sugar, was often enough to start an hour-long conversation. That evening, however, she made no pretense. "I came to ask about Thistle," she said gently, settling onto the floral settee. Mrs. Ledbetter blinked in surprise. "Thistle? What's the little rascal done now? You know she doesn't take to most people. Doesn't trust easily." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "which makes her unusually discerning. You mentioned she'd been watching the hedgerow before the garden party. Yes, very fixated. Sat there all morning. Quite put out when I tried to call her back." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And after the party? Has she been any different?" Mrs. Ledbetter hesitated. "Quieter, perhaps. More alert. She's been watching the same direction in the evenings. Toward the Deverell house." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "You don't suppose someone was visiting the Deverell property in secret, do you?" "Before the death." Mrs. Ledbetter blinked again. "Well, there was a night last week I thought I saw a lantern moving through the orchard. I assumed it was vandals or young Peter playing about, but Miss Marple had a different suspicion. She thanked her hostess and returned home, her mind whirring like a clock wound too tightly. Lanterns in the orchard. Cats watching paths. Geoffrey Denning unnerved not by threats, but by the sense of being watched. That night she sat up later than usual, knitting forgotten on her lap. And when the village clock struck midnight, she quietly opened her front door and stepped out into the stillness. The air was sharp, and the moon painted silver on the stones. She crossed the narrow path between her cottage and the Deverell estate, taking care not to use her torch unless absolutely necessary. She had been this way once already with Craddock, but this time she took the left path, the one that circled behind the orchard. The trees here had not been trimmed in years. Gnarled limbs tangled with wild roses, and the scent of apple blossoms still lingered. Halfway along she paused. Something rustled. She waited. Then, deliberate, low light. A flickering glow from just beyond the hedge. Someone was here. Miss Marple moved carefully, edging around the branches. When she reached the clearing, she saw the figure crouched beside the cellar door, their back turned. The flicker came from a small oil lantern resting on a stone, and the person, though bundled in a dark coat, was unmistakably Diana Westlake. Miss Marple did not cry out. She stepped forward. "My dear," she said gently, "if you needed to retrieve the letter your mother wrote, you should have asked the inspector. He would have returned it without fuss." Diana spun around, gasping. "Miss Marple! I mean no harm, but I do wonder what you hope to accomplish by sneaking back here after the affair seemed so neatly resolved." Diana looked at her, eyes wide and frightened. "I didn't come to steal anything," she said. "I came to destroy something." She held up a second envelope, yellowed but unopened. "It's from my uncle," she whispered. "A confession, maybe, a threat. He kept it here, locked away. I found it after Craddock left the room during our last visit. I thought, if I burned it, I could finally be free of him." Miss Marple reached out and took the envelope. "No one is ever free of the past, Miss Westlake," she said gently. "But burying it never helps." She looked at the handwriting, Denning's, sharp and cold. It was addressed simply, "To be read in the event of my death," and then, quite unexpectedly, Miss Marple said, "Let's read it together." Diana hesitated, then nodded. Miss Marple opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet, unsigned. "If anything happens to me, the blame will fall where it belongs. The girl, Diana. She has motive, opportunity, and by now the key. Let them discover her. Let them turn on her. She may be family, but I do not believe in sentiment." Diana looked horrified. "He wanted them to blame me," Miss Marple nodded. "And he very nearly succeeded. But he underestimated human kindness. Canned cats, Diana looked confused. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Thistle told me more than Mr. Denning ever did. She knew who moved through the hedgerow, who disturbed the orchard, who stood beneath the arbour that afternoon. But more importantly, she knew who didn't. She never once looked at you with distrust. Diana's voice shook. I didn't kill him. No, but he hoped you'd be ruined by the accusation. That letter was his final cruelty. But now it's simply evidence of his spite. They left the orchard in silence. Miss Marple pocketed the letter. It would be shown to Craddock in the morning, and Diana Westlake, should she wish, could claim her family name at last without shame. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat beside the hearth, watching the last of the fire die down. There had been no knife, no gun, no dramatic confession. Just a man so filled with bitterness that he crafted his own undoing. His weapon had been manipulation. His intent, destruction by suggestion, but truth, as ever, had its own quiet power. And of course, there was the cat. Thistle stretched herself across Miss Marple's rug with elegant disdain. Observant creatures, Miss Marple murmured. You and I both. And not so easily deceived. The cat purred once and blinked. The night was calm again. But Miss Marple knew human nature would never sleep for long. The next day, Inspector Craddock read the contents of Geoffrey Denning's final malicious letter in stony silence. They stood in his temporary office, the back room of the vicarage where spare hymnals shared space with an ancient typewriter and a pot of wilting daffodils. Miss Marple had placed the letter on the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as if she were offering a recipe she didn't quite approve of. Craddock looked up after a long pause. He wanted to frame her. Yes, Miss Marple replied softly. And he likely assumed that with a convenient heart attack, she would be the natural suspect. The out-of-place niece with a motive and a legacy to gain. It was a cruel and clever insurance policy. Craddock leaned back in his chair. Only someone who believed themselves unloved would write something like this. Or someone who had spent a great deal of time trying to become unlovable, Miss Marple said. He nodded. Well, this clears Diana Westlake beyond doubt. With Braithwaite's letter from her mother, the inheritance is solid. No court would question her claim now. No, said Miss Marple, but someone else already did. Denning was not alone in his opposition to Diana's claim. Craddock frowned. You think someone else was working against her? Miss Marple's eyes were distant for a moment. I think Geoffrey Denning made it easy to hate him. That's always a dangerous position to be in, Inspector. When someone dies and everyone says good riddance, one must ask, did anyone care enough to stop it? Craddock rubbed his jaw. We've already ruled out murder. But not intent, Miss Marple said. There's a difference between killing a man and allowing him to die when you know that death will benefit you. Craddock was quiet for a long moment. Do you have someone in mind? I think we ought to revisit our assumptions, Miss Marple replied, because I've realized something quite simple. No one has yet answered a very obvious question. Who invited Mr. Denning to the garden party? Craddock sat forward. You mean it wasn't a general invitation? No, said Miss Marple. The event was advertised, yes, but Denning only attended because someone told him, very specifically, that the vicar would be announcing an important update about the Deverell estate. Which he wasn't. That was a lie. One designed to bring Denning into public view. Craddock blinked. Who told him that? Miss Hartnell, Miss Marple said. She mentioned it to Mrs. Bicknell, who passed it along. Said she overheard it from someone at the grocer's, but never remembered who. Craddock narrowed his eyes. So someone planted that seed deliberately, and it worked. Denning came, presumably expecting to challenge or confront someone. Instead, he died in full view of the village, precisely where someone who wanted him silenced could ensure his disgrace. Craddock stood. We need to speak to Miss Hartnell. Miss Lavinia Hartnell was enjoying her morning crossword when the inspector knocked. A robust woman with a fondness for plum-coloured hats and strong opinions, she welcomed Craddock with an arched brow and a plate of cherry biscuits. Oh, I did not invite Mr. Denning, she said firmly. He was entirely objectionable. Always watching people, always writing things down. I told the vicar I wouldn't miss him if he left. Did you tell anyone that the vicar would be making an announcement about the Deverell estate? Me? Miss Hartnell blinked. Certainly not. I may gossip, Inspector, but I don't fabricate. But you did mention it to Mrs. Bicknell. She paused. I may have repeated it, yes, But I didn't start the rumor. I only heard it from Clarice Fielding. Miss Marple, seated in the corner with her knitting, looked up. How curious. Because Mrs. Fielding says she heard it from you. Miss Hartnell frowned. Well, then someone's lying, or... Wait. No, I remember now. She tapped a biscuit on the saucer. It wasn't Clarice. It was Diana Westlake. She came to the shop one morning, asked about the garden party, and she mentioned the vicar might say something about the estate. I didn't think anything of it. Craddock and Miss Marple exchanged glances. Miss Hartnell continued. She said something like, I hope the vicar clears up the confusion about the Deverell legacy once and for all. I assumed it was wishful thinking. I didn't realize she might have said it. Strategically, Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. Thank you, Miss Hartnell, she said calmly. You've been most helpful. Outside, Craddock looked grim. Could it be? Could Diana have lured Denning to the party, knowing that public confrontation might bring on a heart attack? Miss Marple's voice was soft. It's possible. But we must tread carefully, Inspector. People do not always intend what results from their actions. Craddock nodded. We'll speak to her, gently. Diana Westlake answered the door of her lodging house with a tired expression. She looked paler than the day before, her composure fraying around the edges. Craddock wasted no time. Miss Westlake, we've reason to believe that you encouraged Mr. Denning to attend the vicar's garden party by implying there'd be an announcement about the Deverell estate. Diana froze. I didn't. I may have said something like that in passing. I wanted him to come. I thought it was time to confront things publicly. Did you anticipate he might collapse? No, I thought maybe the vicar would actually make a statement. That once Mr. Denning saw the village knew I had a legitimate claim, he'd back off. I didn't mean to cause anything. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. But you did know about his condition, didn't you? Diana said nothing. Miss Marple pressed on. He carried heart pills in his coat pocket. You saw them once when he visited you. You told me so back at the arbor. Diana looked stricken. Yes, she whispered. He said they were for bad days. I didn't think... But when you saw him start to collapse, you didn't go to help him, Miss Marple finished. Diana looked down. I froze. I didn't know what to do. Part of me was terrified. And part of me was relieved. There was a long silence. Craddock's tone was measured. Miss Westlake, we have no legal basis to accuse you. You did not administer poison. You did not lay a hand on him. But you may have engineered the circumstances of his death, indirectly. Diana looked up. I didn't want him dead. I just wanted him to stop. Miss Marple's eyes held no judgment, only a kind of quiet sorrow. Intent, she said, can be like a match dropped near dry grass. One does not mean to start a fire. But the result is the same. That evening, the final notes of the case were written. Clarice Fielding was cleared, though she withdrew from public life with the air of someone who had already paid a penance. Edmund Braithwaite retired even further into seclusion, refusing all interviews. Diana Westlake, though vindicated legally, chose not to remain in Little Witchford. She left quietly 2 weeks later, leaving behind no forwarding address and no piano pupils. Miss Marple watched her go from the window of the tea-room, stirring her cup of Earl Grey. She will carry the weight of this, she said softly to Inspector Craddock, who sat across from her. She didn't kill him, Craddock said. No, Miss Marple agreed, but she let him die. There's a difference. One that only she will ever fully measure. Craddock sipped his tea. And what about the cat? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Thistle saw it all. But she is a cat. She sees and she knows and she remains silent. She looked out over the village green, the sun slanting low, the shadows stretching long. Unlike people, she said, cats do not pretend. The village of Little Witchford resumed its usual rhythm in the days that followed, as though the tremors of Geoffrey Denning's death had simply faded into the hedgerows. The vicarage choir resumed their practice of Jerusalem on Wednesday evenings. The Women's Institute began planning their summer jam stall with fierce diplomacy, and Mrs. Grimshaw's dog once again found itself at odds with the postman. Yet underneath the ordinary surface, something had shifted. The villagers had become quieter in their gossip, more careful with their opinions. It was as though the realization that a man could die in full view of friends and neighbors by something as soft and swift as a stopped heart had unsettled even the most robust tongues. Miss Marple, for her part, felt no satisfaction in the solving of this mystery. There had been no villain cackling behind the curtain, no dagger in the study or pistol behind a hedge. The death of Geoffrey Denning had been slow in its unfolding and swift in its execution. And more than that, it had been invited. Not with intent, perhaps, but with a certain quiet willingness to see a man brought low. She understood human nature. She did not excuse it. It was on a grey morning, 2 weeks after Diana Westlake's quiet departure, that Inspector Craddock returned for one last cup of tea before he left the case entirely in the hands of the county. "I still can't decide," he said as he stirred his cup, "whether this was a case of manslaughter by manipulation or simply the natural conclusion of a bitter life finally catching up with its architect." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes, Inspector, the line between justice and judgment is as thin as the thread on a well-worn glove. Mr. Denning held power over others not through violence, but through pressure. Eventually something or someone pressed back." He leaned back. "Diana Westlake is gone. Left a note for the vicar saying she needed quiet and hoped the house would be claimed by someone with no memory of her family. A sad ending," Miss Marple said, "but not a tragic one." "Sadness, you see, doesn't corrupt. Tragedy often grows from pride." Craddock considered that. "And what about Braithwaite?" "He wrote to me," Miss Marple said, lifting a small envelope from the side table. "He enclosed the original letter from Diana's mother. Said it belongs with her should she ever want to return." Craddock smiled without humor. "Do you think she will?" "I doubt it," Miss Marple said gently. "Little Witchford has long memories and quiet judgments, and even an innocent woman can feel guilty when her relief is mistaken for motive." Craddock stood and picked up his coat. "And yet we still call it justice." Miss Marple met his gaze. "We do. But it doesn't always comfort." He nodded once and left. Later that morning, as the fog lifted from the lanes and the postman passed with a tip of his cap, Miss Marple took a walk toward the edge of the village. The Deverell house stood empty once more. Diana had made no move to reclaim it. A solicitor's notice now hung in the front window, half curled with damp. Miss Marple passed the rusted gate and entered the orchard path, her feet moving carefully between old apple trees and tangled roots. She stopped where Denning had once stood, notebook in hand, staring at boundary stones and pretending he owned something he never could. She knelt briefly to examine the moss-covered rock he had been so taken with. What had he seen there? A symbol of his claim? A detail that made him believe he could rewrite history? Or perhaps he had simply hoped no one would question a man with a file and a frown. Miss Marple rose and continued to the bench at the far side of the path. There, curled in the last of the morning sun, was Thistle. The cat opened one green eye as Miss Marple sat beside her. "You're a patient creature," she said. "I wonder if that's the secret. Patience, not pursuit." The cat purred softly and returned to her sleep. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Denning had died of fear, not violence. Clarice Fielding had confronted him with old rage, Braithwaite with buried truths, and Diana with veiled challenge. No one had planned a murder, yet each had laid a stone in the path to his end. The law could not arrest that, but morality could understand it. Miss Marple had always known that evil wore many faces. Some were charming, some were desperate, and some, like Geoffrey Denning's, were simply ordinary. That afternoon, she returned home to find a visitor waiting. To her surprise, it was Mrs. Ledbetter, Thistle's devoted mistress, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I hope you don't mind," she said, entering with a slight fuss. "I found something while cleaning the attic. Belonged to the Deverell family. My father did odd jobs for them years ago, and he kept it by mistake, I think." She handed Miss Marple the parcel. Inside was a child's drawing. Faded with time, it showed the old Deverell house with large yellow windows and a stick-figure family in front. At the bottom, written in careful, crooked letters, was the name Diana. Miss Marple touched it lightly. "She was here before," she said. "Not just by birth, but by memory," Mrs. Ledbetter nodded. "I think she loved this place once, before anyone told her she didn't belong." Miss Marple looked up. "Do you suppose she might come back?" Mrs. Ledbetter's answer was quiet. "Only if we let her." That night Miss Marple wrote a letter. She addressed it to Diana Westlake, care of the solicitor handling the estate, and enclosed the drawing. She did not write many words, just a simple note. Sometimes belonging is not about claiming. It is about being remembered. You are. She sealed it and left it by the door for the morning post. The case was closed. No one would be arrested. No charges filed. But in the quiet lanes of Little Witchford, the effects of the truth had already taken root, like ivy finding cracks in old stone. Justice had come not with sirens or handcuffs, but with reflection, and with the watchful eyes of a cat who had seen too much and said nothing at all. The next day, Miss Marple began knitting a new shawl, soft lavender wool, fine and intricate. As she worked, she thought of Diana, of Denning, of the villagers who spoke so often of goodness while living with so many little sins, and she thought, not for the first time, that the most dangerous secrets were those that wore the mask of respectability. But Little Witchford, for now, had returned to itself until the next whisper, until the next shadow beneath the tea and roses. Spring deepened in Little Witchford, and with it came a soft rebirth. The fields were awash in new green, and the cherry trees behind the vicarage bloomed in blushing rose. The murder, or the death, as it was now more diplomatically referred to, had begun to sink beneath layers of ordinary life. It was still discussed, yes, but only in low tones over shop counters or in the gaps between hymn verses, as though to speak of it too clearly might invite more trouble. Miss Marple, too, found herself returning to her routines. She planted a new row of sweet peas along the southern fence. She visited Miss Hartnell to discuss the spring fete bunting. She even judged a modest sponge cake competition, giving second prize to a rather smug Mrs. Bicknell, who declared her almond essence a secret weapon. But one afternoon, a letter arrived that brought everything back. It was forwarded through the solicitor's office and postmarked from a quiet village in Cornwall. The envelope was plain, the handwriting careful but firm. Miss Marple, seated in her garden with a shawl about her shoulders and a small biscuit tin at her elbow, read it in full before uttering a sound. Then she folded it twice and set it gently on the table beside her. Inside, Diana Westlake had written, "Dear Miss Marple, I received your letter and the drawing. I cried when I opened the parcel. I hadn't remembered making it, and yet the moment I saw those yellow windows I was 6 again, watching my mother plant lavender beside the steps. Thank you. No one else would have thought it mattered. I want you to know I've found a place. It's quiet here. I teach 2 children their scales and try to remember how to live without fear. That's harder than I expected. But I also wanted to say something I couldn't say before. That letter Geoffrey wrote, the one meant to accuse me, I think he always knew he was going to die like that. Not just soon, but badly. He couldn't bear to leave the world without someone to blame. I suppose in the end I disappointed him. Thank you for seeing me, not as a name in a will, but as a person. Warmly, Diana. Diana. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and let out a long, soft breath. The words sat in her like warm tea, quiet and bittersweet. She did not answer immediately. She let the letter live in her kitchen drawer for several days, as if needing time to settle between her mind and her fingers. Then, on a rainy Thursday, she penned a response. Just 3 lines. Dear Diana, the weight of injustice often rests most heavily on those who never committed it, but you, I believe, are strong enough to carry what others could not. Yours ever, J. Marple. She sealed it, affixed a floral stamp, and sent it on its way. The following morning, Miss Marple made a quiet visit to the Deverell property. No one had yet bought it, though the notice had been taken down. The solicitor had written to say that the matter of ownership was settled, and that the grounds would be held in trust for 6 months, should the heir wish to return. Miss Marple carried with her a small tin of seeds, lavender. Of course, the gate was no longer rusted shut. She walked slowly down the overgrown path, then knelt beside the crumbling steps of the front porch. The earth was dry but willing, and her trowel moved easily. She planted 5 seeds and covered them gently, patting the soil with care. Then she stood, brushed her hands together and stepped back. They'll grow, she said softly, to no one in particular, even if no one's watching. A rustle in the hedge made her glance up. Thistle, the tabby cat, emerged from a gap in the briar. Sleek and clean, tail twitching once before she circled Miss Marple's ankles and sat beside the seeds. "Come to supervise?" Miss Marple asked, smiling faintly. Thistle blinked. Green eyes calm, they stood together a moment. Old woman and cat, both with eyes that had seen too much, and both content to say nothing about it. Miss Marple did not return immediately to her cottage. Instead, she took the long way around, passing the homes of villagers who had, knowingly or not, played parts in the silent drama of Denning's demise. Mrs. Pym, in her lace-curtained kitchen, was slicing strawberries and arguing with the radio. Miss Hartnell was outside knitting a scarf for her great-nephew, muttering that boys these days don't wear anything decent. Mr. Benwick was pruning roses with the concentration of a surgeon. Each lived on unchanged in habit, and yet slightly, just slightly, less certain in their gossip. It was the effect, Miss Marple believed, of brushing up against something uncomfortably real. At the grocer's, young Peter Hawkes spotted her as she passed. "Miss Marple," he called. "Did they ever catch who did it?" She smiled kindly. "No need, Peter, the case is closed. But no one did it, right?" "No," she said, pausing at the gate. "But a great many people helped it happen." Peter frowned at this, puzzled, then nodded solemnly as if he were committing it to memory. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a final visit on the subject. Edmund Braithwaite came just after tea, his cane tapping lightly on the stone path. He carried a small leather-bound book. "I found this among Denning's things," he said without preamble. "A journal, earlier than the one you and Craddock saw. More personal. He didn't keep it in the safe, just tucked into a drawer." Miss Marple accepted it with care. "Have you read it?" "Yes," Braithwaite said. He was not a happy man. She turned to the first page. The handwriting was the same, precise, cold. But the content was different. There were no legal claims, no inventories of stones or inheritance records. Just line after line of bitterness. "They talk about bloodlines, but no one wants mine. My sister disgraced the family, and I'm left sweeping up her failures. Let them try to challenge me. I know how to make them regret it." Miss Marple closed the book. "It wasn't about money," she said. Braithwaite nodded. "No, it was about winning." She handed it back. "You'll do with it as you see fit. But I suggest not publishing it. There's no redemption in those pages." "Only dust," he smiled faintly. "That was my conclusion as well." They sat quietly for a while. When he left, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire and resumed her knitting, a pattern she had set aside during the investigation, a simple moss-stitch shawl, pale blue. The hours passed, and the sky turned a deeper grey. She thought of Denning, of Diana, of Clarice Fielding and the others. Not as suspects, not even as characters, but as people. People who had carried too much, said too little, and waited too long. The fire popped gently. Thistle, now a frequent visitor, curled beside the hearth, and Miss Marple, that quiet observer of human mischief, resumed her stitches with the calm precision of someone who understood that stories did not need to end with answers, only with understanding. The lavender would bloom again. The past could not be changed, but perhaps in Little Witchford it could finally be forgiven. It was a month after Geoffrey Denning's death when the lavender began to sprout. Miss Marple, tending to her garden in the early light, noticed the first tender green shoots poking through the soil beside the crumbling steps of the Deverell house. They were delicate things, soft and stubborn. She had not returned every day, not even every week, but when she did, she came quietly, like a memory revisiting its own room. She stood there now, with her trowel tucked under one arm and her gloves folded neatly in her pocket, watching the small signs of life pushing up from the soil. The cat Thistle had already arrived and taken her usual place beneath the bench. "Faithful as ever," Miss Marple said softly. The house remained closed, but something about it felt less abandoned, as if the windows had ceased sulking and the porch no longer mourned its former inhabitants. The notice in the window had been removed. A trim young man in a dark suit had been seen inspecting the side fences with a clipboard 2 days prior. Solicitors, most likely, arranging matters now that the tangle of inheritance had been cleared. Diana Westlake had not returned, but she had sent a second letter. It arrived 3 days ago, in pale blue stationery that smelled faintly of violets. Miss Marple had read it 3 times before setting it into the drawer beside the other. "The house is not mine," Diana had written. "I know it is, by law, by blood, but I no longer belong there. I've spent too long trying to unearth ghosts I should have left at peace. And yet, because of you, I feel like someone might remember the child I was. That has to be enough. I've instructed the solicitor to sell the property and use the proceeds to fund a music program for children in Little Witchford. I hope no one will mind. They would, of course. Some villagers always minded anything new. But even Miss Hartnell had conceded, after much grumbling, that a music fund was less vulgar than a statue or a plaque. And Miss Crabtree had already asked if her niece might apply for piano lessons. The legacy was secure, though the heir had quietly walked away. Miss Marple returned to her cottage and set about preparing tea. There was no particular ceremony to it, just a well-worn ritual, the clink of cup against saucer, the gentle swish of hot water. She moved slowly these days, but deliberately. She had never been one to waste steps. As she placed her tea on the table, the knock came. "Inspector Craddock," she said with a smile when she opened the door. "I thought you'd long since escaped us." He removed his hat sheepishly. "I was in Much Minster on other business, and thought I'd check in. Can't quite shake the feeling this case left behind." Miss Marple nodded. "Come in, then. There's still some ginger cake." They settled into their familiar seats, Craddock with his hands folded awkwardly in his lap, Miss Marple with her teacup balanced just so. "I suppose it's really over now," he said after a while. "No charges, no arrest, just a quiet rearrangement of lives." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "As most true crimes are, Inspector. The mess of life is rarely resolved by a tidy hand." He nodded. "There are still villagers who think someone ought to have been punished." "Oh, they always do," Miss Marple said mildly. "But there's a difference between guilt and consequence. Geoffrey Denning was not murdered, but his death was not without authorship. Do you believe Diana knew what might happen to him?" Craddock asked, not accusingly, but with the tired persistence of a man still chasing clarity. "I believe," said Miss Marple after a pause, "that she hoped for justice, and that she was too human to resist the opportunity when it came. But I do not believe she ever wanted his death. She merely stopped trying to prevent it." Craddock let that sit between them. "And Clarice Fielding?" "She was angry," Miss Marple said, "but she never struck him. She was merely the last shadow he saw. Braithwaite gave him the truth. Clarice gave him fear. Diana gave him silence. And you," Craddock said quietly, "gave the rest of us the truth." Miss Marple smiled. "I merely noticed what others ignored." She rose and fetched the tin of letters, setting it beside him. "I'll be giving these to the vicar," she said. "So the village can understand, not the scandal, but the sadness. If you let rumors fester, they grow sharp. But when you tell the story plainly, it becomes soft again. Just another tale in the village's long memory." Craddock flipped through one letter, then another. "Diana's music fund," he said. "I heard the vicar might be putting her mother's old upright piano in the community hall. Wouldn't that be fitting?" Miss Marple said, "Something that once stood silent being heard again, being heard again." They finished their tea in companionable quiet. Later, Miss Marple walked him to the door. "You'll keep in touch?" Craddock asked. "I always do." He tipped his hat and disappeared down the lane. As she turned back inside, Miss Marple felt a shift in the air, not a chill, but a weight lifting. Not closure, exactly. Closure was a modern word. It suggested the sort of clean finality that life rarely offered. What she felt was something older, something quieter. Resolution. That evening, as dusk fell and the village lights blinked on one by one, Miss Marple sat beside her fire with her knitting and a fresh pot of tea. The shawl was nearly finished now, pale blue and soft as breath. Thistle, who had taken to appearing at sunset and vanishing again before midnight, curled on the hearthrug. Miss Marple glanced at her. "You watched the whole thing unfold," she said aloud, voice light with amusement. "And not once did you interfere." The cat yawned. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "That's quite wise." She picked up her needles again, letting the rhythmic click carry her into the evening. Outside, the air was still. The lavender continued to grow, and in Little Witchford the shadows were just a little softer now. The final Sunday in April brought with it a soft breeze and an uncommon sense of calm to Little Witchford. The village green was dotted with children flying paper kites, their strings arcing in gentle patterns against the sky. The air smelled faintly of damp grass and distant cake, and for once, the church bells rang without any overtone of tension. Miss Marple attended morning service, sitting quietly 2 pews behind the vicar, her hands folded on her lap. She listened not just to the sermon, but to the tone of the village, how the whispered rumors had eased into memory, how names once tinged with suspicion now passed without pause. Afterward, outside in the churchyard, she was joined by Inspector Craddock. looking somewhat out of place in his civilian jacket and slightly scuffed shoes. "Well," he said, brushing a leaf from his sleeve, "I suppose this is it. Everything's tidied away. The music fund's been announced. Diana's name has been cleared, and I haven't had to take down a single formal statement in over a fortnight. Then you must count it a rare success," Miss Marple said, her smile light but her eyes sharp. He looked at her sideways. "You don't quite believe that's the end, do you?" "Oh, it's the end," she said, "but perhaps not quite in the way people think." Craddock tilted his head. "Go on." She looked out over the gravestones, her gaze settling not on anyone in particular, but on the spaces between them. "You see, Inspector, there was a moment, just before Geoffrey Denning died, that I haven't spoken of. Not because I wanted to withhold it, but because I wasn't entirely sure what I'd seen, or rather what I hadn't." Craddock waited. Clarice Fielding confessed to confronting him. That much we know. She insisted she never touched him, and that was true. But I watched her retreat up the hedgerow path. She looked shaken. "But there was someone else near the arbor before the scream. Someone else." Miss Marple nodded. "Not close enough to be seen easily. Not where the crowd was gathering. But I noticed a shape. A figure moving away through the back hedge. Someone small, deliberately quiet." Craddock's brow furrowed. "But everyone was accounted for." "Not quite. One person left before the constable arrived, saying she had a headache and wished to avoid the unpleasantness." He blinked. "Mrs. Ledbetter?" "Yes," he stared at her. "You think she—" "No," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Not murder, but knowledge. You see, Mrs. Ledbetter had been Geoffrey Denning's landlady once before, many years ago, when he stayed under a different name in a different village. She never spoke of it, perhaps out of shame, perhaps to protect herself, but I noticed how quickly she recognized him that day at the garden party. She said nothing. But Thistle told me all I needed to know." Craddock gave a baffled smile. "The cat?" She watched Mrs. Ledbetter as closely as she watched the hedgerow. Cats, you know, are very good judges of discomfort. And Thistle was not looking for threats. She was watching guilt. Craddock ran a hand through his hair. What was Mrs. Ledbetter guilty of? "Not a crime," Miss Marple said. "A warning." She had seen Denning ruin people before. She knew his methods, his obsessions. She saw him arriving here, pressing again at old property lines, harassing old names. And she knew, in her own quiet way, that he could not be allowed to continue. Craddock exhaled slowly. "So she set the rumor," Miss Marple said simply. "She told Diana indirectly that the vicar might mention the estate. She spoke in just the right shop, in just the right tone where she knew Miss Hartnell would hear her. It was all carefully done. The rumor was planted so that Denning would arrive, and so that the pressure would build." She turned to Craddock. "She never expected death, only humiliation, but she arranged it nonetheless." Craddock rubbed his chin. "So what do we do?" "Nothing," Miss Marple said. "Geoffrey Denning died of his own making, but those who surrounded him all played their parts. Clarice Fielding, Diana Westlake, Edmund Braithwaite, even Mrs. Ledbetter. It wasn't a plot, Inspector. It was a tide. Each person added weight to the wave. It was going to crash eventually. Denning merely happened to be standing in its path." Craddock was silent. Then he asked, "And you? What part did you play?" Miss Marple smiled. "The part of the old woman who noticed when the cat turned its head." They stood a moment longer beneath the grey sky, watching the children with their kites and the last of the villagers drifting homeward. Craddock finally said, "It's not the neatest ending." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But it's the truest." They parted with a nod. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her knitting and her roses. She trimmed the deadheads with precise little snips, humming faintly. The lavender outside the Deverell house was beginning to take hold, and in the final light of day, Thistle appeared once more, jumping softly to the wall and sitting with the stillness of something that remembered everything and intended to speak of none of it. Miss Marple looked up from her chair and gave a small, approving nod. "Justice," she murmured, "does not always wear a uniform." And with that she returned to her stitching, the quiet rhythm of the needles echoing the steady, unwavering pulse of a village that would always, eventually, bury its secrets beneath the bloom of something new, the bloom of something